more information on these ancient wine jars than some modern bottles of wine. So that's an interesting parallel. In addition to these economic texts, we're lucky enough to have a tremendous amount of literature and poetry from Ugarit that's preserved. Epics from heroes, similar to those that we're familiar with, like the Epic of Gilgamesh. We're told of the tale of a man named Akhat, who got in a fight actually with the goddess Anat, and it was a struggle over a sacred bow, which he refused to give up. Anat ends up accidentally killing him and laments his death. We have a story of King Karat, the myth of a king who, in going into battle, offers to give a sacrifice to the gods, and after being victorious, forgets to do so. He's stricken with a plague by the goddess Athri Rat, and essentially, suffers for his lack of piety. So in these stories, you can actually see the kind of theme, piety to the gods, the relationship between the gods and the citizens of Ugarit at this time. So they carry this sort of general theme forward. We also have complete cycles of myths, mainly centering around the key divinity at Ugarit, and that's the god Baal. And Baal is a storm god. He's a fairly minor deity in the pantheon of Ugaritic gods. At the head of that pantheon is the god El. Underneath El is the god Dagan, who is sometimes said to be the father of Baal, and in other versions, Baal is the father of is the son of El. Anat is the sister of Baal. And essentially what we see in this Baal cycle is Baal coming up against a tremendous amount of adversity. As a young god, he has to establish himself. And he ends up fighting one of his brothers, the god of the sea, a god named Yam. The two clash. Baal is victorious, and because he's victorious, he's able to petition El for his own city. And that city, of course, is the city of Ugarit. Baal gets a palace and is going to live there quite happily with his sister. However, the story isn't going to end there. Interestingly, Baal is then confronted by the god Mot. It's just sort of L-O-T. So we talked about Yam, his brother, god of the sea. Another brother, the god Mot, who is really the sort of demonic force, the personification of death. And it's always bad when you go up against the personification of death. You really don't do well. Baal is killed in this process. And what we read is this very interesting series of events in which Anat ends up descending to the underworld to try to find her brother. And she enters the underworld, and instead of finding her brother, she actually finds the god Mot, and proceeds to completely destroy him in all sorts of awful ways, crushing him, squishing him, cutting him up, and spreading his ashes out across the land. For this reason, Baal is able to return, and so we get this image of resurrection. And those of you who are familiar with Egyptian mythology, you might find some parallels here with the story of Isis and Osiris, the death of Osiris and the resurrection by way of, the Isis collecting his body parts and putting him back together. And there certainly are parallels between Ugarit and Egypt during this time. So it's not an accident. Those parallels exist. Long story short, Baal is able to return. Mot comes back as well, but then El intercedes and basically, sort of settles the whole thing. This Deus ex machina steps in, fixes everything, establishing Baal as, king of Ugarit and as the premier sort of source of power. So what we have here is an etiological myth, an explanatory myth that talks in terms of the rise of Baal and a series of stories, a cycle of stories, the Baal cycle, that explains the origin of the city of Ugarit and the pantheon of gods, how they operate there. Let's see here. Should also say that these texts are interesting for other reasons. There are a tremendous number of parallels between Ugaritic religious texts and then texts that show up in the Hebrew Bible. And this caused quite a bit of stir when these were found by Schaeffer in 1929. We see some parallels, for example, in some of the poetry. So one of the tablets, KTU 113, says, "Baal is your slave, O Yam. Baal is your slave, Nahar. May the celestial messengers bless the prince. May the celestial messengers send you strength." This format of repetition, right? And when we look at poetry in the Old Testament, like the Song of Miriam, we see the same repetition, the same structure, only this time applied to the God of the Hebrews, the God Yahweh. So we read in Miriam, Yahweh is a man of war, Yahweh is his name. Your right hand, Yahweh, glorious in power. Your right hand, Yahweh, its shattered enemy. So this isn't to say that the texts, just because they have ties to Canaanite Ugaritic myth, doesn't invalidate the Old Testament. But what it does say is that these two hearken from the same pool of literary traditions and have some relation during this time. We also see some shared words and phrases in both texts, which are interesting to look at. All right, so let's take a look at the site itself. Let's look at some architecture. Murex, wine. All right, so we're at Ras Shamra, and we're looking at the site itself. And it's interesting to note, I mentioned Ugarit was unique in many ways. There's almost no mud brick architecture at this site. Almost all of the architecture is done in stone. And when we talk about Cyprus on Wednesday, we'll see that that is very common at sites in Cyprus like Enkomi to have solid stone architecture. And of course timber, right? Timber is being used to roof these structures and support the walls. With the exception of the North Palace, as you can see right here, all of the architecture that has been excavated, and again this is only about 1/6 of the site has been excavated. All of it dates to the late Bronze Age. We have a main entrance to the city right here in the far west. It's a fortified entrance with a postern gate, which we'll look at in a moment, that's flanked by a large tower and leads into this royal zone immediately. Entering the city, you find yourself in a courtyard next to the entrance to the royal palace and another administrative building, an older one called the North Palace, right here to the north. Other zones include a religious zone, the Acropolis. You can see here an Acropolis with two temples, the Temple of Baal and the Temple of Dagon, and the administrative complex that's called the House of the Chief Priest. It's called that because this is where a number of those religious texts were actually found at the site, an archive of texts. Most of the streets, let's zoom in here, let's take a look at the Citadel first. Most of the streets you can see here are very narrow. They're about 1 to 2.5 meters wide, and you can see this very well planned out city. Again, it's very fragmentary, but these series of east-west and north-south running streets that surround this temple complex, these two temples, right? The Temple of Baal here, and then the Temple of Dagon as well. The city's organized into city blocks with houses that vary in shape and size, but we really don't see any class segregation here at Ugarit. Houses often abut, small houses abut larger ones. They abut temples and workshops. They're built up against the side of the palaces. And while they vary, there are some specific elements that are common to each one. Each house has a central courtyard, for one thing, and a series of stairs leading up to the upper level. The upper levels were thought to actually be the domestic quarters, and the lower levels were used for things like, for example, murex dyeing or animal husbandry, keeping animals in the lower levels. The houses were wonderfully planned, along with the streets, to include a sewage system. The drainage in the house would run out to gutters that run along the side of the street, carrying away wastewater, acting as sewage, carrying human waste down and away from the city. So So certainly health, this plays into health when you have so many people living in such a small location. Also interestingly, the burial practices at Ugarit are quite different than what we've seen elsewhere in the Late Bronze Age. We saw those extramural cemeteries and interesting ways of burying the dead. Those anthropoid sarcophagi, if you remember when we were talking about Canaan and Egypt, that were buried outside of the city. At Ugarit, all of the dead are buried inside the city. And there appear to be large family graves in each of these homes, a large cyst in which the dead would be kept. This is also true of the palace, which we'll look at in a moment. But for the most part, while these houses vary in size and wealth, they do have these common attributes and speak to a tremendous amount of planning. This is a ready-built city, probably after, again, this destruction in 1360 BCE. Let's take a look at this temple. Again, we're looking at the temple of Baal here. It's a fairly simple temple for the most part. It occupies the summit, again, of the city. This is the highest point of the city. And really, it's a fairly simple plan, as you can see here. It would have been approached by a series of stairs, and you would have entered into a courtyard and made an immediate 90-degree turn and looked into the center of this axial temple. Fairly large in size. There's an altar in this courtyard where you would have made sacrifices before entering the temple, and the various rituals that would have been associated, cleansing. This looks similar to some of the other temples we see contemporary in places like some of the ones that we looked at before, the Egyptian-inspired temples. Right, this is what I wanted to mention. This temple is interesting for a number of reasons. The sort of structure you see here are the remains of a staircase that ran around the inside three walls of this temple. And I don't have a scale here, but these walls are tremendously thick. It's a large structure, about 16 by 22 meters, with very, very thick walls, 4 to 5 meters thick. And as you know by now, when you have walls that are 4 to 5 meters thick, what does that mean? Yeah, exactly, second story. This is not for defense, this is for building more stories on top. And this would have been a very, very high structure, probably about 20 meters high, if these stairs are anything to judge by. And again, just to explain that, the staircase would have run up, you would have entered here, right, in the stairwell, gone up the first flight, the second flight, and then the third flight, 1, 2, 3, and had access to the roof, which probably also had a series of rituals, things taking place up there. The fact that Baal is a storm god, has probably a lot to do with this. He's a god. We know this temple is dedicated to him from the finds that were found there. The stele, for example, which is Baal with a thunderbolt, was discovered there, along with some dedications that name him. So we know that this temple is dedicated to him. And we imagine what this would have been like. Again, 20 meters up from the plane, and then an additional 20 meters. At that height, you would actually be able to see Cyprus on a clear day. So the fact that at this temple, a number of stone anchors are dedicated to the god as devotional offerings probably means that this temple had a religious function when it came to trade and shipping. Because again, this is the Mediterranean, right? This is very, very difficult sailing. Those of you who have read the Odyssey and the Iliad, or rather the Odyssey, I should say specifically, Homer writes about how difficult it is to sail, and it's a very, very tricky sailing. So if you make this journey successfully, well, then maybe you're going to devote your altar, your anchor to the